All right, everyone, we should be live on YouTube as well as Zoom. To my co-hosts, if you hear background noise, please identify which guest that's coming from and mute their microphone. To everyone, welcome. This is the first online presentation from the Grand Council of the Allied Masonic Degrees of the United States of America. We have the privilege of having this presentation tonight thanks to our Grand Master, Most Venerable Brother Glenn Cook. Glenn, I'd open the floor to you for comments.
Well, thank you, Brother Aaron. It's been 6 weeks since I've had a haircut and 3 weeks since I've had a shave. Now, we can't help you with a shave or haircut tonight, but we think we can help with a Masonic experience. The genesis of this event was a discussion with our Grand Superintendent, Corey Curtis, out of Michigan. I turned it over to our Senior Grand Warden, Aaron Schumacher. He recruited Chris Hodap and Eric Diamond, in particular, Clifton Truman, to help out with this. I note that we also have on the line Past Grand Master Harrison out of Texas and a sovereign Past Grand Master of the Allied Masonic Degrees, and my old friend and our Grand Master of Missouri, Stanton Brown. Brother Aaron, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Grand Master. As the Grand Master mentioned, we're privileged to have an all-star cast this evening. I'll begin with Venerable Brother Eric Diamond. Eric is the founder and host of the Ex Oriente podcast. This is claimed by most, including myself, to be the first and most successful of the online podcasts. He's a past Sovereign Master of Oriente Council number 379, located in Chicago, Illinois.
Hi, Aaron. Thanks for having me here.
Next, we have Venerable Brother Chris Hodap. Chris is the author of Freemasons for Dummies, which is the worldwide best-selling introduction to the Masonic fraternity. He also hosts the world's most popular Masonic news blog site. He is a past Sovereign Master of Imhotep Council number 434, located in Indianapolis. Welcome, Chris.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Aaron. I appreciate it.
And Brother Clifton Truman Daniel. Clifton Truman Daniel is the oldest grandson of President Harry S Truman and his wife, Bess. He is the son of author Margaret Truman and former New York Times managing editor E. Clifton Daniel Jr. Mr. Daniel is an honorary chairman of the board of the Truman Presidential Library Institute, which is the nonprofit partner of the Truman Presidential Library and Museum, located in Independence, Missouri. And he is the board secretary of the Harry S. Truman Scholarship Foundation. Brother Daniel's been a member of Oriental Lodge number 33, located in Chicago, Illinois, since 2011. Welcome, Clifton.
Thanks, Aaron. Glad to be here. Grand Master, brothers.
Aaron, before we get started, I just wanted to check, are you live streaming to Facebook?
It is live streaming to YouTube, and our co-hosts are posting the link around Facebook.
Very good.
Brethren, we're going to kick off our discussion tonight with a question that begins Most Worshipful Brother Truman's Masonic journey. And that question is, what inspired Harry S. Truman to become a Freemason?
If I may, this is Clifton. If I may, I will read from my grandfather's memoirs where he talks about that, talks about the incident, the time that he he started his Masonic journey. He writes, one day in late 1908, a cousin of my mother came to the farm to look at some stock. I noticed a Masonic pin on his coat and told him that I had always wanted to be a member. A few days later, he brought me an application for membership in Belton Lodge number 450 at Belton, Missouri. So that's, as far as I know, that's the first writing. That's the first time that he ever mentioned that, memoirs or letters. He didn't start writing letters to he talked about Masonry in letters to my grandmother when they were courting and when they were, well, a lot during their courtship, but they did not start their courtship until 1910. So this was 1908.
It's interesting as you go through Alan Roberts in his book Brother Truman really tried to go through a lot of the letters in Truman's collection, and really tried to pluck out every kind of Masonic reference that he could find. And what's interesting is that in the letters that he writes to Bess throughout their courtship, and before they actually started courting, but in the letters that he wrote to her, he's constantly talking about, you know, I attended this lodge. He became very, very active very early on, and became an excellent ritualist, and quickly became known far and wide. This is before he ran for elective office or anything else. Quickly became known far and wide throughout Missouri, because he visited as widely as he possibly could. So he was active right from the get-go.
And that's a perfect segue. That leads us into our next question. How active of a Freemason was Brother Truman?
Short answer, as Chris just said, very. He was very active, certainly early on, but throughout his life, and he certainly had some other constraints on his time, being not only a farmer full-time for nearly 12 years between 1906 and 1917, but then also when he came back from World War I, county judge, then United States Senator, Vice President, President of the United States. But he remained as active as he could in each of those positions. So he was an active Mason.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that as you read through some of the correspondence, he obsessively wrote to Bess in that earlier age. That was so very common with so many people, that they would have these correspondences like this and talk about all the things they were doing every day. And so he talks about the many meetings that he would attend, the people that he met. Even during World War I, he talks about how he was very proud to bring fellow soldiers, fellow officers into the fraternity. He really and truly, he got bitten by the Masonic bug big and early, and it never left him. Interestingly, you know, during his presidency, here's one for you. April the 12th, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt dies. And it had been sort of a long illness. It was the worst kept secret in Washington that Roosevelt was in ill health. And so he dies on April 12th. And Truman gets called and says, you need to come to the White House right now because something's happened. And he goes to the White House, and Eleanor Roosevelt tells him that FDR has died and that he's now the president. And the first thing that he has to do, he walks out of the Oval Office and he sends a message across town. He was supposed to be at Masonic Degrees that night. And he has to send apologies to the lodge to tell them that he can't make it, something's come up. And he's now the president. So, you know, this happened throughout his life, that he was always trying to make time to go to lodge.
Well, he also, I always loved the incident. Somebody once asked him, and I don't know who it was, somebody once asked him to write down his proudest accomplishments. And he actually put Grand Master of Masons in Missouri above President of the United States.
Yeah.
So.
And he said that consistently throughout his life. After he became president, and frankly, even before he became president, after he was Grand Master of Missouri, he would always tell people that was his proudest achievement.
Just as a point of interest right now, Dr. Graham held a Zoom conference this afternoon at 4 o'clock, where he talked about April 12th and what most worshipful Brother Harry had to go through that day. So it was interesting. It was a little earlier today.
Yeah, I watched that myself. Kurt did a great job. They all did. Truman Library. Thank you for that.
And Dr. Kurt Graham, who they just mentioned, is the director of the Harry S Truman Presidential Library and Museum here in Independence. So in addition to Most Worshipful Brother Truman serving as Grand Master of Masons in Missouri, he assisted in forming the Missouri Lodge of Research. In fact, he was Grand Master when it was formed. His signature is on the charter. He received his 33rd degree of Freemasonry in the Scottish Rite. He was an active member in the York Rite bodies. And since this is a Grand Council AMD presentation, I'm proud to note that he was also awarded the Knight Grand Cross and the Allied Masonic degrees. We're going to go into a story that I think Clifton and Chris will kind of tag team on, and that is the famous story of the White House stones with the Mason marks being shared with the Grand Lodges.
Chris, you want to start that, or do you want to?
Sure. No, sure. 1948, very famous story. 1948, Margaret Truman is upstairs in the White House in the residence and playing the piano, and the leg of the piano goes right through the floor. And suddenly they get very concerned about the condition of the White House. And Harry Truman asks for an extensive survey as to what's going on with the building on the inside. Come to find out, it's literally falling apart on the inside. The building's been standing for 150 years, been through the fire after the War of 1812. Major beams were cracked in half, and the place is literally falling down from the inside. So
I tried to go ahead.
No, run it. Go ahead.
I was just going to say I tried to when I do a lecture on this, and I talked to the White House Historical Association, and my original thought was to blame every president before my grandfather for ruining the White House for him. But they laughed and said, no, you can't do that. You can only blame two presidents. You can blame Teddy Roosevelt and you can blame Calvin Coolidge. But as you said, Chris, before that, you have to blame the British for burning it in 1814.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I always have two answers: blame the British or blame the French. Yeah, those are the standard two answers for everything in Freemasonry. So, but so essentially, cut to the chase. The Trumans move out of the building, and the entire building is gutted. And if you've never heard these stories before, literally nothing inside the White House is older than 1952 in terms of the actual structure itself. Much of it, when they rebuilt it, they attempted to ape the original of what was there. They covered it photographically and tried to recreate it. Other areas they added substantially. Something that few people really talk about when that story comes up is we're talking 1948, 1949. The Soviets have set off their own atomic bombs. Suddenly you're approaching the Korean War, and there's a fear that's going to turn into World War III. And the White House is a sitting duck for atomic warfare all of a sudden, something no one had ever had to think about until 2 years before. And so one of the things they did was they dug another 2 or 3 floor sub basement underneath it in this big subterranean area, and built a hardened bomb shelter big enough. It had like 70 cots for everybody inside the White House staff in case of a nuclear attack. But at any rate, so everything is gutted on the inside, and there are famous photographs of dump trucks driving around on the inside of the excavated interior of the White House, and they find the original foundation stones when they built the White House, when they were building the original White House, and James Hobam brought a team of Scottish operative masons in, and they constructed the foundation of the building. And all of those stones, or many of the stones, had masons' marks, had operative masons' marks. Each operative stonemason put his own mark on many of the foundation stones. And so the president hears about these, finds them, sees them, and has 50 of them isolated to send to all the Grand Lodges in the United States.
And those were the only stones that he would allow anybody to touch. Those trucks and bulldozers that you see driving around in the photo of the gutted White House were originally, in the early days of the Reconstruction, those were taken apart outside and brought in piece by piece and rebuilt inside, because Grandpa would not let them make a larger hole to drive the trucks in, because he said that was defacing unnecessarily the symbol of this country, the symbol of our democracy. So the stones, the operative masons' marks were one thing, a gesture to the Grand Lodges, but he wouldn't let the construction companies touch the outside of the building.
He had a very strong sense of responsibility to the heritage of the building, to the history of the building. He had a very early on in his political career, when he was a judge, he had supervised the reconstruction of the Jackson County Courthouse and was very proud of that achievement. He told people as a young man he was a frustrated architect, and suddenly he had the ability to make his mark in some substantial buildings. And so in the White House, he would do things that he insisted that the contractors not plaster their signs on the outside of because it defaced the building. He wouldn't let them build temporary housing structures inside, or put temporary toilets in, the earlier equivalent of portalets, that kind of thing. He wouldn't let them do anything like that because it was defacing the building in some way. It was not honorable to the building.
No, and there's one of those, this is not the picture, but there's another picture of the inside of the interior like that with just the walls standing. And there's a shadowy figure at the back of the photo. And that's obviously just some workman who moved and Abby Rowe was the photographer who took all of these photos. They're in the collection at the Truman Library. But there's a shadowy figure. It's a guy who moved while the shutter was open. But there was some sort of ghost conspiracy site online a couple of years ago that the folks swear that that's the ghost of Abraham Lincoln, standing in the dirt at the bottom because they have knocked out the floor under Mr. Lincoln's bedroom. So he obviously just fell down to the basement level and stood there until they built his bedroom back.
I always loved the story that when Harry's mother came, she was such an under-reconstructed Southerner that she said she'd sleep in any bedroom except Lincoln's.
Yeah, well,
if she had to sleep in the Lincoln bedroom, she'd sleep on the floor.
That was my mother did that in the limo back from the airport. My mother told me she turned to her grandmother just to cause trouble and said, "We got the Lincoln bedroom all fixed up for you." And that's when my great grandmother said, "Yeah, well, if there's nowhere else, I'll take the floor. Thank you very much."
Clifton, in conversations we've had over the years, this next question is one that I know is of great interest to you. And I hope that you could shed some light on this question. Do you feel that the lessons taught in Freemasonry had an impact on Truman's decisions?
Certainly. He felt very strongly, as we've been talking about, he believed in the tenets of Masonry. They informed his decisions. They informed his personality. He was like that anyway. He wanted to join. So this is a man who already had a great belief system in place. My mother used to tell me the story, and I think we mentioned this the other day, Aaron, that when they went out to the farm in Grandview, my mother and my grandmother and my grandfather to have Sunday dinners with the Truman family, the last thing that my great grandmother, Mattie Truman, told my grandfather as he went back to work on the county courthouse was, "Harry, you be good." So even as a judge, his mother was sending him off with that reminder. She also gave him Mark Twain's quote to take to Washington with him, which you all know this quote: "Always do right. It'll astound a few people. It'll gratify a few people and astound everybody else." And he lived by that and lived by his. So for him, Masonry was a natural. This was reinforcing, as it is for all of us, reinforcing and improving and honing a great value system. So yes, it informed his decisions. He's one of the most empathetic, honorable presidents we've ever had.
Something else that's interesting is that when he was in office, when he was serving as a senator, when he served as president, you had a very high percentage of other people in government who were also Masons. Whether they were Democrats or Republicans didn't matter to him so much as the fact that, well, if the guy is a Mason, I've known him Masonically, he's a trustworthy guy. That sort, today there would be criticism that it was an old boys network, but it wasn't really. It was a shorthand for getting to know people when it's not always practical to do that on a simple basis. And so if someone was a Mason, it was an automatic entree to the fact that it was a natural assumption that you're an honorable, trustworthy, you're a cut above other honorable, trustworthy guys. Because Truman said something else too. He said, "I just took it as read that if you were in government, you were probably a pretty honorable, trustworthy guy. Even if you did, bad things, you were better than the average cut above, because that's what you're supposed to be when you're here."
Well, then the counter to that I love the story. I'm going to forget the senator's name. When Grandpa first got to Washington, the United States Senate, one of the old guard senators told him, "Don't get an inferiority complex. For the first 6 months, you'll wonder how the hell you got here. And ever after that, you will wonder how the hell the rest of us got here.
Chris, you'll kick off this next question well, and that has to do with the Masonic Service Association and its effort, the Masonic Service Center. Do you have any comments you'd like to share on this?
Yeah, this could go long, so please cut me off if you're watching the clock, because I'm not watching the clock. Masonic Service Association came about after World War I because, previously Grand Lodges had chartered military lodges. That was a tradition that came out of England and then Scotland as well during the colonial periods. And then the last time Grand Lodges really tried that was during the Civil War period, and it turned out to be sort of chaotic and it didn't work well. And so by the time you get to World War I, Grand Lodges weren't really doing anything Masonically to help the war effort or to really help servicemen. And so, and when they tried to approach the War Department at the time and say, how can we as a fraternity help? The War Department was like, we're not talking to whatever it was in those days, 46, 47 of you. If you want to come with a united front with something you want to propose, that's fine. But we're not dealing with an ad hoc group of, a bunch of guys that can't get along to change leaders every year. And, this is too much of a mess. So after World War I, the Masonic Service Association was formed in Iowa and became an association, much essentially what it is today, a cooperative body of all the Grand Lodges in the United States and really in North America now. And not everybody joined, but by the 1940s, I think there were 32 or 35 Grand Lodges that had become involved in it. And Carl Cloudy, which many of you will recognize from the old Tyler Talks stories, was their executive director in the beginning. And they had three basic missions when they started. One was Masonic education, and they came up with the idea of the short talk bulletins, which we all still get in Lodge every single month. Whether anybody reads them out loud in Lodge or not, doesn't matter. They send them religiously every single month. And then the second thing was to cooperate for disaster reliefs. And interesting, given the way that World War II started for the United States, it's interesting that the first disaster appeal of the new Masonic Service Association, I think in 1927, was for the Grand Lodge of Japan. It was like a typhoon that had hit Japan, and so they raised money for them. So as World War II approaches, Harry Truman and Carl Cloudy get together and decide we have to come up with a mission. Harry Truman particularly wanted to help the servicemen. He'd served in World War I. He was upset that there was no Masonic support when he was overseas. He really had hoped that he could do something Masonically while he was in Europe, in France during the war. And there wasn't really anything. So he wanted to try and change that. He said, Freemasons ought to do something. And so they did a survey in the 1930s to determine where the major Masonic buildings were in the United States. And they found that Freemasons had large major buildings in every major and minor town in the country. And these would be ideally located, especially if they were close to a military base, to put some kind of a service organization there for servicemen. So in right before the attack on Pearl Harbor in July of 1941, Harry Truman does a national radio address, and he's promoting the Freemasons to the United States. And he gives this radio address, and in the end of it, he talks about how the Masons of the United States need to get together and really help the American servicemen because war is coming. We may not like it, but war is coming to the United States, and the Freemasons ought to step up and do something about that. And so what they propose are Masonic service centers. They were called different things, the Army, Navy, Masonic Service Center. They were called a couple of different things, but essentially they were the USO. And this was before Franklin Roosevelt actually formulated the USO, the Freemasons had already cooked up that idea. And the idea was you pick a couple of centrally located large Masonic buildings and you put in basically a club that's open to all the service people. You provide meals, you provide transportation. If a soldier gets a 3-day pass, and you know, he's out in Camp Muck and Fuss out in the middle of nowhere, you go send a car and you pick him up, you bring him to town, you tell him the hot spots, you invite him to a dance. If he's looking for a dance partner, there were women from the Eastern Star and the Rainbow Girls and the Job's Daughters that were called the Masonic Cadets. And they would organize dances and dinners, and you know, and they would have card tables set up and pool tables. They'd provide letter writing material. In some cases, they provided free long distance phone calls, which was a heck of a lot more expensive than you can imagine. Turned out to be one of the most expensive things they provided. And so that was the idea behind the Masonic Service Centers. In Indiana, we had 2 of them, one in Indianapolis and one in Evansville. Other states had more, other states had less. But by the end of the war, there were 90 of them around the country. And the last one that opened was dear to Harry Truman's heart, in Paris.
Very nice, thank you. And I think it's fitting that 2 or 3 days ago, the Truman Presidential Library posted a video clip of President Truman talking about, he was then senator, talking about Masonic Service Center. So we're going to attempt to play this video now. It'll take just a second to queue up.
As a past Grand Master of the great state of Missouri, I'm very much interested in the Masonic Service Association. In the last war, we had 49 Grand Lodges trying to do the work of one. In unity is strength. This time, when our boys come marching home victorious, none will look askance and say, where was Freemasonry in this hour of need? Approximately 10% of the boys in the service are Freemasons. Another 15% are close kin of Freemasons. Through the association, Freemasonry is meeting the challenge of their great need. At this very moment, in foxholes and on shipboard, beneath the sea and in the air, countless hands are being clasped in fraternal recognition as brothers find one another in the darkness as well as in the daylight. And countless fathers, bravely wishing Godspeed to their departing sons, are saying, boy, when your hour of darkness and loneliness comes, find a Freemason and tell him you're the son of a Freemason, and you'll find a friend. And through our great association, the flower of Freemasonry is being made to bloom in the rocky soil of war's desolation. And the fruits of Freemasonry are being shared by every boy and girl who wears the uniform. There's nothing for sale in Masonic service centers. Neither mineral nor metal is the price of Freemasonry service to our boys. And yet, our centers are supported without fanfare or public appeal, because in our heart glows the great light of charity, unostentatious but sincere. Each of us giving generously because we have seen the light and heard the cry of the widow's son.
It's an outstanding clip. Do you have any response, Clifton?
That's great. That's the first time I've seen that. Thank you.
I think what's interesting, I mean, imagine for a second the power of that message going out. That was on it was a radio address, and it was also a newsreel clip, and so it was playing in movie theaters as well. And here's a guy who is about to be named as FDR's running mate in the next year, and making this appeal on behalf of Freemasonry and saying, you know, boy, you find a Freemason and he'll help you, you know. By the end of the war, 10% of the entire US population was in the military, and which is a staggering number to think of. And of that, 25% of everyone in the service was either a Mason or from a Masonic family. You know, somebody in the family was a Mason. And so with those kind of numbers and that kind of message going out, I swear it's no wonder that you know, within 7-8 years after the end of the war, we were at the height of our membership numbers because you had such high visibility reputation going on about the fraternity.
Well, many would say that President Truman's most lasting legacy involves his planning and orchestration of the post-World War II rebuilding. And I've queued up a series of topics that I would open up to Chris and Clifton to discuss. But these 5 bullet points here are the programs that President Truman put together to establish institutions to promote peace and prosperity post-World War II. Clifton?
Yeah, if I may, again, reading from my grandfather's memoirs on the subject. In working with and working out the North Atlantic Treaty, we had made a truly momentous decision. As I described it to the National Security Council, it could be called an offensive-defensive alliance to maintain the peace in the North Atlantic area, but without the automatic provision for war. The treaty, he said, he included the North Atlantic Treaty along with the adherence to the United Nations, the Marshall Plan, and the Point 4 foreign aid program among the foundations of our foreign policy in my inaugural address on January 20th, 1949. And he says a little bit further, he told people, he gave an address at the formal signing of the treaty on April 4th, 1949. He said, this treaty was indeed an act of neighborliness and compared the 12 nations to a group of householders who decide that they have so much in common that it would be to their mutual advantage to associate themselves more formally. So for him, this was, of course, this was a bulwark against Soviet aggression, Soviet expansion, but there was also a very human element to it, and a very, it still holds, but this is what post-war Europe has looked like ever since.
Truman's experiences shaped the man. Before he ran for any kind of office, before he ran for judge in Missouri, he had, again, he'd been in World War I. World War I was an interesting growth experience for him because he was thrown into situations with people from all over the world, all over, you know, different parts of the country, different ethnic groups, different nationalities of people. And, you know, you read things from that period. People today, you know, will read that stuff and be shocked at the language that people use and the way they refer to people. But it was a shorthand at that time. And he was surrounded in World War I. You know, he made a big deal out of the fact that here he was, this Missouri Freemason, thrown into an artillery battery with a bunch of Catholics and Irishmen, and figured they'd all give him a hard time. And instead, it was a wonderful experience for him. A Catholic priest turned out to be one of his closest friends, who was a Catholic chaplain. And he learned, you know, he was a farmer. He was in the oil business. You know, people always made a gag that, you know, he was a haberdasher. Well, he was a hell of a lot more than a haberdasher. He had such a wide range of businesses he was involved in and experience. And so after World War II, one of the things, and Clifton was talking about this when we chatted last week before this, that he was damn bound determined they weren't going to make the same mistakes after World War II that had been made after World War I, when you know, Germany was punished horribly economically, that arguably caused World War II.
Well, and he, if I may, Chris, just I've got it up in front of me, some notes from a speech I gave a few years ago at Fort Leavenworth. He changed his thinking. He did a complete 180. As an artillery captain, he wrote to my grandmother on October 30th, 1918, "I'm for peace, but that gang, the Germans, should be given a bayonet piece and be made to pay for what they've done to France." And on November 11th, 1918, Armistice Day, "It's a shame we can't go in and devastate Germany and cut off a few of the Dutch kids' hands and feet and scalp a few of their old men. But I guess it'll be better to make them work for France and Belgium for 50 years. So he was right there in that mindset. in 1918. But of course, by the time that World War II came around, events that again shaped him, changed his thinking 180 degrees.
And interestingly, he goes to Potsdam and he's meeting with Churchill and Stalin is echoing those very same sentiments. I want the Germans to pay. They're going to pay for 100 years. They're going to pay millions, and it's like, no, we're not going to do that again.
For this next question, I'm going to introduce Most Worshipful Brother John Hess, who's a past Grand Master of Masons in Missouri. He serves as our Grand Lodge librarian today, and he knows an awful lot about this next topic, and that is President Truman's friendship with Ray von Denslow.
Good evening. Harry Truman and Ray Denslow go back a long time in Missouri Masonic history. When Mr. Truman was District Deputy Grand Master of the 59th District, Ray Denslow was Grand Master of the Grand Lodge and was going to lay the cornerstone of the new post office in Kansas City, and Mr. Truman was responsible to make all that happen. And there were 3,500 people there, and it was a roaring success. So right after that, and a big write-up in the Kansas City paper about that, it came time to choose an appointment for the advancing line of the Grand Lodge of Missouri. And there were 3 candidates. And in Denslow's memoirs, he said the first candidate is going to be a Grand Commander, so he's too busy. And the second candidate is just too dumb to be Grand Master. And Harry Truman would do a good job. So that's kind of how it all started with Mr. Truman in the advancing line of the Grand Lodge. Denslow was referred to by Mr. Truman as his best damn Republican friend. Denslow was a staunch Republican, and of course, Harry was a staunch Democrat, but it didn't make any difference because they were Masonic brothers. And they worked together tremendously. And at the end of the war, Mr. Truman saw what happened in Europe. The Masonic fraternity was attacked by the Nazis as much as any other group in the European continent. And so he asked Ray V. Denslow to head a commission in 1945 to go to Europe to try to reestablish Masonry in Europe, because he knew if that could be accomplished, then they would be a strong deterrent to communism, because he knew that was going to be the next battle. And so Ray V. Denslow flew on a kind of a military plane without any records, except he held in his pocket a letter that says, "Please extend all courtesies, Harry S. Truman." And he went from Norway to Greece, and there's many records of him reestablishing Masonry in all that part of the world. We have in our library photographs of the Grand Lodge in Berlin when it was at the end of the war, and then how it was reconstructed by 1949. And that was all Denslow's work. Somehow in 1945, Denslow got into Czechoslovakia, controlled by the Russians. We don't know how he did that, except we have his passport that shows that he did, because Himmler took all the Masonic books and put them in a castle north of Prague, and we're going to try to reestablish a secret society within the SS, and wanted to use the Masonic fraternity as a model for that. And Denslow went to that castle to try to recover those Masonic books for the Grand Lodges that they were taking them. So their friendship went on and on and on. And when Denslow died, Mr. Truman was in New York and couldn't make his funeral, but was very saddened that he couldn't attend.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. And that leads in very well to this next slide. This apron that you see here is located in the former lodge of Ray V. Denslow in Trenton, Missouri. And it's an interesting apron that caught my attention when visiting the lodge. And it has a placard which addresses a lot of what John just talked about. That placard says, in the years prior to and during World War II, the Nazis effectively destroyed Freemasonry and its infrastructure in Germany and in the other European countries which they overran. All lodge buildings and their properties were confiscated. as were all bank accounts and other financial assets. These were converted to the aims of the German war machine. All records of the Grand Lodges and their constituent lodges were destroyed, including membership rosters, minute books, archives, furniture, and contents, as if the fraternity had never existed. Prominent Masons either fled if possible, disavowed Masonic affiliation, or were arrested and sent to concentration camps to perish. This next part, I think, is the most interesting, and John covered this. At the war's end, Ray von Denslow was sent to Europe as a personal representative of President Harry S. Truman to assess the situation, make recommendations which could lead to the revival of the fraternity, and where possible, to actually initiate the process. I'm going to skip a little bit of this description, but this apron that you see here was an apron that was presented to members of the prestigious Headquarters Military Lodge, which was the first lodge in Germany following World War II. These jewels that you see here were also presented to Ray von Denslow, and these were gifts from various European lodges and Grand Lodges thanking Ray von Denslow for his efforts to restore Freemasonry in Europe. This next story is an excellent example of Most Worshipful Brother Truman's fraternal spirit. And I think Clifton and Chris both have stories that they'd like to share here, but it has to do with a Master Mason degree in Beech Grove Lodge number 694.
That's I love this story. You know that, and this was in and Chris, this was I believe, was he on the campaign trail in 1948?
Yeah, it was in 1948. He was making a whistle stop tour throughout the Midwest, and he came through Indiana, went to Chicago, went up to Minneapolis, I think, and then looped back around, came down through Indiana again on the way back.
Okay.
And yeah, go if
no, go ahead. Go ahead. If you'll, I'll tell you, if you'll tell the particulars of the young man,
sure, sure,
Donald Bauermeister and
sure.
and the lodge, then I'll handle the Secret Service bit.
Okay, sure. And things vary depending on who's telling the story. Is either Noblesville or Kokomo, Indiana, and it could be either one. I don't remember. I don't know who was right, but at one of the whistle stops, Truman is giving a speech, and he looks out into the audience, and there's a young sailor standing near the front in his dress whites, and he spots him and he recognizes him. And when the speech is over, he calls the young man up, and it turns out to be a young man named Donald Earl Baumeister, who was a pharmacist mate and a physical therapist on board the presidential yacht, the Williamsburg, in Washington, and he was Harry Truman's physical therapist. And he said, "What in the heck are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, I took some leave, and I came home to Indiana, and I'm having my Master Mason degree down in Indianapolis, and I've got my dad with me and my uncle." And so Truman invites him to come on board the presidential train, and suddenly says to the Secret Service, "I'm going to that Master Mason degree." So
I'd always heard that he had to take he had to take the Secret Service with him, but he also snuck out the hotel they were staying that night, and he had to sneak out because the press is all out front. So Grandpa and I don't know, 2 or 3 or 4 of his detail went with him and went over to the lodge. And as they are getting ready to go in, the Secret Service, of course, tries to walk in first and beside him. And Grandpa said, "Stop. Are you any of you Masons?" And they said, "Well, no." And he said, "Well, you can't go in there. This is a Masonic lodge. You can't go in." "But we're the Secret Service." "I don't care. You're not Masons and you can't go in." And they kept arguing back and forth until finally Grandpa said, "Look, I am safer in there with those guys than I am going to be anywhere else. Don't worry about it." And they gave in. But I always love the image of 3 or 4 heavily armed Secret Service men and the Tyler with a sword standing at the door, barring their way in.
Yeah, imagine a couple of heavily armed guys and a 70-year-old guy with a tin sword saying, "No, you're not coming in here."
Yeah, so, "You're not coming in."
When Truman tells the Secret Service that there's been a change of plan, he's supposed to come to Indianapolis, give a big speech, to the Democratic Party and a big fundraising dinner, and then go across to the War Memorial and give a great big citywide speech. So after that, everybody sees him get into a limousine, and he waves goodnight to the crowd, and off they go. And the press follows him to Union Station, and they see a guy in a coat get back on the train and sort of waves over his shoulder. Well, meanwhile, Truman and his detail have driven down to the south side of Indianapolis to a little suburb called Beech Grove. And Beech Grove was a railroad shop town. It was one of the largest railroad shops in the country. And so what had obviously happened was, it was supposed to be a big secret, right? So what had obviously happened was the Secret Service starts telegraphing down the line how to, they have to send an advance crew to the lodge and do all this to make sure everything's okay. And so obviously one of the railroad guys intercepts the telegraph message. So by the time the presidential limousine pulls up and it's supposed to be a big secret, there are 1,000 people waiting in the street. And the newspaper's there to cover him going into the building and everything. So it's the worst kept secret in town, apparently. But the photograph that you're seeing is of Harry Truman handing Don Ballmeister a Masonic ring that his parents had bought for him. And that ring we have in our museum in Indianapolis. The family was kind enough to make a loan to us of that, along with his Masonic Bible and we have the minute book from that night that describes everything. And there's the Bible that he signed. And there's a bronze plaque outside the lodge today down in Beech Grove. And unfortunately, last May, there was an electrical fire and it burned out the lodge room. And all the furniture from that night was destroyed. That's a picture of the lodge room. But we have a lot of the paper records. The minute book, I think, was water damaged, but we have the Bible and the ring and that kind of stuff. So not all of it was destroyed, but the lodge room was. So they're going to rebuild it and try and do something with the furniture to make some kind of memento of that night.
Did any members of the Secret Service ever become brothers in order to help with those situations in lodge?
I don't know.
Not that I've heard of. Yeah, don't know.
I've not ever heard that.
That would be interesting to know.
Yeah.
I had heard that rumor at one point that eventually a Secret Service member just became a brother in order to sit in lodge with the president.
Well, it would have been easier if they had just gone through the ranks and said, which one of you is a Mason? There had to be somebody in the Secret Service. I mean, the Secret Service is not known for being a bunch of miscreants and ne'er-do-wells.
Although, if you believe the story that it was totally spontaneous, at least on their part, they may not have had that opportunity to do it. The family has in later years, not to take too much gloss off the story, but the family in later years said that Ballmeister had told the president that he was going to have his Master Mason degree, and if there's any possibility, and Truman went, God, I'd love to go if we could make that timing work. And he said, I'll tell you what, wear your dress whites and try and get in the front of the crowd, and if I spot you, I'll see if we can work this out. So it wasn't entirely spontaneous, according to the family, but still, it doesn't detract from the story in any way, shape, or form.
Chris, you do way too much research. It's like we were talking about the other day. Damn an eyewitness, he always ruins a good story.
Yeah.
Damn a historian, you guys.
I know.
No, it's good to know all those details, because that's the way I heard it, of course, from my mother, was that he snuck out and went over to the lodge, and it was a very simple story. She didn't have all the details either. She wasn't on the train, I don't think, at that point.
Well, and I think his chief of staff, who did an audio recording of his memoirs in like 1961, and I've forgotten his name now, but he describes the incident as well. And as far as he was concerned, it was a complete surprise to him and to the Secret Service.
Yeah.
Well, from what I understand, there are a number of questions that have come in via YouTube, and we're starting to have some come in through our chat here. Jacob, if you could take a look at the proper places on Facebook and let us know what you see there.
Actually, I have some.
I'm going to kick off the questions with one from Mohammed Yatim, who is the Deputy Grand Master of the Grand Council of Odd Masonic Degrees. He asked, what is the story behind his middle name being just one letter, S?
The story behind that is that his paternal grandfather was Anderson Shipp Truman, S-H-I-P-P, and his maternal grandfather was Solomon Young. Rather than risk hurting feelings on either side, they just gave him the initial S and let it stand for whichever grandfather thought it was his. And I'm sure it was I'm sure they knew up front that that's what we're going to do. We can't make up our minds, so it's just going to be an S. And somebody asked, they asked him, the question comes up, is there a period behind the S or not? Because it's not a name, it's just an S. I worked for Truman College for a number of years. They did not use the period. I am the honorary chairman of the Truman Library Institute. They do use the period.
Wow.
The Associated Press has been calling for the period ever since he became president or before, just because it looks right. You don't put a period behind a middle initial, everybody assumes you've forgotten it and they go correct it anyway. They asked my grandfather, the media asked my grandfather, Mr. President, is it supposed to have a period or not? And my grandfather said, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference to me. Do what you want.
I love it. Eric, you said there are a number of questions on YouTube.
Yeah, so I wanted to use a co-host prerogative and ask one of my own first. One of Truman's most notable acts was to recognize the brand new state of Israel, even as many officials, including his Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, who was vehemently opposed to the establishment of the Jewish state. Clifton, could you shed some insight into why he took that decision, and did his Masonic experience influence his thinking on recognition at all?
I think so. Early on, Grandpa had always said that as a teenager, as a boy and as a teenager, a young man, he read every single book in the Independence, Missouri Library, about 2,000 volumes. He said, including the encyclopedias. He also read the family Bible through from cover to cover at least twice. So he was very aware of biblical history. He had been, like the rest of the world, he had been horrified by the Holocaust. He understood thousands of years of Jewish history, thousands of years of looking for a homeland. And it was important to him to do what he thought was the right thing. Sometime after he recognized the new state of Israel, the new state's chief rabbi, Rabbi Herzog, their first chief rabbi, told my grandfather that God had put him in his mother's womb to help bring about the refounding of Israel after 3,000 years. And David Niles, himself Jewish, and an special assistant to my grandfather, thought the rabbi had gone a little over the top with that comment. But when he turned to look at my grandfather, he saw there were tears in his eyes. So it was a very emotional, historic thing for my grandfather to do, and something that it was that deep to him.
This next question comes from Hadi Awad, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, Hadi. What was the Masonic exposure of President Truman with foreign countries or foreign jurisdictions, Grand Lodges?
Chris, you want to?
Wow. I honestly did not come across any descriptions of him visiting foreign lodges. I really don't know how to answer that. I'm not aware that he actually attended foreign lodges.
I think he actually sent Ray V. Denslow to do that for him.
Yeah,
that was gonna be my answer as well. We know for a fact that he communicated with other foreign Grand Lodges through the Grand Secretary of the Grand Lodge of Missouri, and Ray Von Denslow was the individual that he designated to represent him in those efforts.
Now, I will say in Missouri for at least 1 year and probably more, he was the official reviewer for the annual communication, which meant we don't talk about that job a lot today in a lot of jurisdictions, but in those days it was somebody's job to sit down and read the annual communication reports of every single jurisdiction and then report to your state what was going on around the Masonic world. And he did that for at least 1 year and maybe more. And it actually got him in trouble.
I think he did it. I think he did it for about 30 years.
Oh, did he really? See, I
Masonic
don't
world.
know. I
You
only
know-
came across the mention of the one year when he got himself crossways with John Cowles of the Scottish Rite. So yeah, he may very well, he was a voracious reader. So it
Yeah.
makes sense that he did it for a long time.
In the middle 30s to 1940, if you look at the Masonic world, there were numerous reports of what was happening in Europe to the Masonic fraternity from the Nazis, and he was reporting that as early as 1935.
Yeah, I do remember that he was very early on calling the alarm about what was going on with the suppression of Freemasonry throughout Europe.
I have a comment from earlier from Ryan Branson, and Ryan comments that he's proud to say that Tuscan Lodge number 360 is a keeper of a White House stone gifted by Most Worshipful Brother Truman. And I would open up comments from Brother Branson or Right Worshipful Brother Ty Troitlar, if either one of them would like to speak about that. I'm happy to unmute either one of you. Just raise your hand. I can see you both. All right, Ryan, I'm going to pick on you since you shared that, if I can unmute you. Doesn't look like I can. So Ty, you get to talk.
The story that was handed down to me through Truman Lodge, through Tuscan Lodge, was that President Truman's aide de camp, he was a Virginian. I'm missing his name at the moment, but he was a military officer and traveled with him all the time in St. Louis. He actually was responsible for bringing the stone over and bringing Harry over to Tuscan, because Harry loved to visit Tuscan Lodge. And to this day, that stone resides there. I think it's the 51st stone. And that stone is quite revered. And also because of all of that interplay, Tuscan has a, shall we say, non-standard form of closing that was handed down from Virginia that exists inside of Tuscan Lodge.
Wow.
I have another question from YouTube from Tim Thompson. How active was Brother Truman in Freemasonry after his presidency? Did he hold any offices or titles during that period?
I don't know the answer to that, Chris. To you, and just as an aside, this is a weird. I had no idea as a grandchild that my grandfather had been a Freemason until I was an adult. That was not something that was that's some sort of family failing, but not something that was present. Maybe they thought I just wouldn't understand what that meant, but I was not. That was not part of the Truman legend in our family.
Well, there's an interesting. There's another question that kind of dovetails into this. So, was your grandfather's Masonic experience, did that inspire you to become a Freemason?
Yes, that's. But I don't know if you could say inspire. It was. I'd always been interested, but and had for years had friends who were Masons. But I was honored to be made a Mason at sight by both Illinois and Missouri Masons.
Now your grandfather.
You know
your grandfather wouldn't have approved of that.
Well, good thing he's not here.
He didn't like it when George Marshall got made a Mason at sight.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I didn't think he would mind anything anybody did for George Marshall.
No. I guess he gave the Grand Master of District of Columbia hell for doing it.
I would note that Most Worshipful Brother John Hess was the Grand Master of Missouri at that time when you were made a Mason at sight.
That's right. He was.
And if you'll remember, you were obligated with Missouri work on a first degree in Illinois, the same work that your grandfather would have been obligated with.
Right.
And then
now I feel terrible.
I participated in the third degree, and the ritual was so different. I had no idea what was going on, but it was a lot of fun.
Could be worse. You could have been in Pennsylvania.
There we go. We had another question come in from Robert Wolfarth, who's on this call. He says, outside of Masonic circles, how often do you come across people who have an interest in his Masonic activities?
Outside Masonic circles? Wow. I don't know that I've ever had that question come up, unless it happened to fall into a TV interview or something like that, but not often, if at all, from outside Masonic circles.
Okay. Ryan Branson asked the question, most worshipful Brother Truman being so compassionate to the Jewish plight of his homeland, what was his stance on the African-American plight in his homeland in that particular time period?
Of course, in that time period, Grandpa was getting stories, and this was happening. African-American soldiers were coming back from World War II and being persecuted, lynched, back in their southern home states, and and I'm gonna forget the man's name now. Sergeant Isaac Woodard came back from service overseas and was pulled off a bus, I believe in South Carolina or Georgia, and beaten and blinded by the local sheriff and his deputies, ostensibly for having the gall to ask the bus driver if he could make a quick bathroom run when the bus stopped at a station further back up the line. That and other stories got to my grandfather, and he was infuriated, and he pushed for an investigation and a trial of Sheriff Linwood Shull and his deputies, and of course an all-white jury exonerated Shull. But this was also the impetus for the desegregation of the armed services.
And Ryan, if you have any other questions, just send them to the chat. I cannot see your face at this time, but I trust you're still here. Until then, Brother Bill Snyder commented that he was told that Truman attended Mount McDonald Lodge and Independence Lodge, as well as Mount Washington Lodge at various times after 1953 and into the mid-1960s. He also believes that he visited Grandview and Belton Lodges. I can tell you through family legend that he definitely attended Mount Washington Lodge. He used to play cards with my great-great-grandfather, and they attended Mount Washington together. I also know from various Yorkite minute books that he attended Yorkite bodies after his presidency. Ryan did send a note back and said thank you, so I believe his question was answered. For those who are monitoring Facebook and YouTube, Eric and Jacob, how are we doing? Do we have any other questions on those two platforms?
Just checking real quick.
I didn't see anything on Facebook a moment ago, but I'll double check.
You know, it's interesting. Somebody asked the question about how many non-Masons express any kind of interest in his Masonic career. You know, I've got David McCullough's like 2,000 page biography of Harry Truman. And if you go through the index, there are about 9 references to Masonry out of all those pages. And all of them are very offhand of, you know, then he, you know, he was a Mason, as was somebody else. You know, they're just very offhand. Yeah, we're sort of off everybody's radar screen, I'm afraid.
David Chichinadze on YouTube is asking, what do you think was the most important legacy President Truman left to the fraternity? I mean, we know his legacy to the country, but what was his legacy to the fraternity?
Well, the answer I give to that, and the answer might serve for both the fraternity and the country. People sometimes ask me that question, and I'm sure they expect me to say the Marshall Plan or NATO or the Truman Doctrine. But I always wind up saying that I think his greatest legacy was showing that, and in the case of the fraternity, showing that a decent, honest, hardworking farmer, soldier, small businessman, county commissioner can rise to the highest office in this land and do a better job of it than almost anybody else. In fact, they list Grandpa as I think they routinely list him as number 5 behind Washington, Lincoln, and Teddy and Franklin Roosevelt. And the family stance is we hope somebody finds some dirt on Lincoln or Washington so we can move Grandpa up.
And that reminds me of Truman's Scottish Rite petition, which is located in the Valley of Kansas City. And this was, of course, I think 1919, so well before his political career. But under occupation, it says farmer. And so I like to look at that frequently and remember where he began. And as you said, what he rise to accomplish later in life.
You know, I think maybe another one of his legacies was that he really believed in the Masonic jurisdictions of a Grand Lodge and the power of a Grand Master in his jurisdiction, and did not want other groups to infringe upon that authority. He was very strong about that. And I think that's a legacy that we live with today, fortunately.
Are there any other questions for those of you who are on Zoom? Feel free to unmute your microphone and chime in.
If I could, being a Columbia grad myself, and him spending, a fair amount of time at the university, do you believe that his Masonic experience influenced his tenure there? In terms of being president of the university and whatnot?
That was Eisenhower.
And you're right, it was. Sorry.
It's okay. I'll call Mary Jean Eisenhower and ask her.
There we go. If you could, that'd be interesting to know.
Well, brethren and guests, we've reached the end of our discussion for this evening. I would turn this over to Chris Hodap first for any parting comments.
I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. This all sort of came together serendipitously. It's funny, just by sheer coincidence or accidents, I was bumping up against Harry Truman a lot over the last 2 years in different research projects that I was doing for the Masonic Library and Museum of Indiana and some of our exhibits. And so it's like Harry just keeps coming back and running into things that I'm doing. And this was really set off when the Truman Library posted that video clip that we ran tonight, because it intersected with a slideshow that I did, and it's on YouTube now. There's a slideshow I did about the Masonic Service Centers. And so this all fell together in a week's time. And so I really appreciate Aaron setting this up and Clifton taking part in this. This has really been a tremendous opportunity to do this.
Thank you, Chris. It was great to have you here tonight. I appreciate your knowledge and expertise. It contributed greatly to this. Clifton, any parting comments?
Just to say thank you. Thank you to you and to the Grand Master and to Chris and everybody for taking part in this. Like Chris said, I'm delighted to be able to do this. Also, thank you all for breaking up the boredom that we're all trapped in. I feel lucky that things aren't worse than they are. I know they're bad for a lot of people, but it's nice to touch base. It's nice to be able to communicate and commune still. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you again. Going with Masonic custom, I'm going to ask the Grand Master of the Allied Masonic degrees for his parting comments, and then we'll finish with the Grand Master of Masons in Missouri, where I'm located, as part of Masonic custom. So, Most Venerable Brother Cook, any comments that you'd like to share?
Brother Aaron, thank you, and thank you to all those who presented this evening. This has been an excellent example of one of the roles of the Allied Masonic degrees, to present lectures, papers, presentations on Masonic matters. The second, to participate and study in the various degrees that we control. And you can see more of those at amdusa.org. I'm happy to hear from my friend, the Grand Master.
Let me unmute him real quick.
Always.
Grand Master, you're muted. There you go.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to personally thank Most Worshipful Brother Glenn Cook and Aaron Shoemaker and Chris Hodap and Eric for setting this up. This is an example of where we've had the technology and we've chosen to not utilize it to its full extent. Unfortunately, it took an event like this for it to start to be able to utilize, we have to, and most worshipful Brother Glenn, I appreciate the comments you made about the importance of the experience inside a consecrated room and how important that is. But certainly this is a technology that we need to embrace and embrace fully and utilize it to the best that we can for not just Masonic education, but checking up on our fellows, our brothers, our sisters, wherever. In my message this year, when I was elected and installed Grand Master, I talked about how important the tools of our craft are, and we need to reflect on those and then practice them. And this is an excellent opportunity. Little did I know that we were going to have this pandemic and that it was going to be even more important that we reach out to everyone around us and demonstrate those principles that we profess to live by. And again, this is an opportunity for us to stay in touch and also to share ideas about how we can best serve our membership and our communities. So thank you all for putting this together, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you, Grand Master.
Thank you.
Thank you, Grand Master. I'm going to stop the live stream to YouTube.